So good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to introduce myself. I'm Siobhan Mullally, UN Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons, and also Professor of Human Rights Law at the Irish Centre for Human Rights in the National University of Ireland in Galway. And today's seminar is part of a series of events and collaborations that we have with the Refugee Law Project as part of a jointly hosted project that's funded by the Irish Research Council and Irish Aid. And specifically, we're looking at the intersections of human trafficking, forced displacement, and gender, and the difficulties and questions that arise with regard to ensuring effective assistance and protection for trafficked persons in the context of forced displacement. So we've had an ongoing series of seminars, mostly virtually in the last year, and have also produced a series of policy briefs that are available open access online to really try to examine and delve a little bit deeper into the questions around why we have such limited information around who might be victims of trafficking or who are at greatest risk of trafficking in situations of forced displacement, whether internally or across borders. And the idea for today's seminar arose really from our last event, where a lot of questions and concerns were raised around ensuring that you have timely identification of victims of trafficking and ensuring that you have ways of gathering data, of documenting who may be a victim, who may be particularly at risk, and how to ensure that that feeds into policy processes and into humanitarian action in thinking about planning humanitarian assistance, humanitarian programming, and responses to situations of displacement, and really looking at the whole range of gender issues and questions that arise, not presuming any kind of stereotypes around who is a victim of trafficking. And the event has been organized to mark World Day Against Trafficking in Persons. And the theme of that this year is to ensure a focus on survivor leadership and partnership with survivors. And the Refugee Law Project, of course, has vast experience of building partnerships and ensuring leadership in policy and practice by those most affected by situations of displacement and human rights violations. So we're really pleased to have the seminar today. We have 3 speakers, and we hope that we'll have plenty of time for your questions, comments, and discussion as well, as we really try to think more about how to change our practice and policy in the area of anti-trafficking measures. So we're going to kick off with Dr. Chris Dolan. And many of you already know Chris. Chris is the director of the Refugee Law Project here at the School of Law in Makerere University. He's also a visiting professor at Ulster University's Incore and Transitional Justice Institute. And he has extensive experience of working with refugee communities in South Africa, in Democratic Republic of the Congo, and of course in Uganda, as well as with ex-combatants in Mozambique and internally displaced persons in Uganda. And the Refugee Law Project works throughout the refugee hosting areas of Uganda and works closely with duty bearers, so with government offices, including on the basis of an MOU with the Office of the Prime Minister. And the Refugee Law Project is heavily engaged with questions around asylum determination appeals, as well as engaging with communities affected by conflict-related sexual violence. And this is a topic on which Chris has published widely on. So we're delighted to have Chris to kick off today's seminar, which is looking at identification and documentation of trafficked persons in situations of forced displacement. Handing over to you, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Siobhan, and for that introduction. And I just to re-echo what you've said about the project and how, as a result of this project, this question of how do we identify victims, survivors, or people at risk of trafficking within humanitarian context has become very central to our thinking and our questioning. And I think, like with our work on sexual violence in conflict, we've been grappling with the seeming opacity of the issue, the way it is hidden away. Sometimes it feels as though trafficking persons into and from humanitarian contexts is so well hidden that it barely registers as a protection concern in meetings of humanitarian organizations at a settlement level. And as we noted in our concept note for the event, key stakeholders engaged in this research project to date have acknowledged that, notwithstanding the enactment of Uganda's Prevention of Trafficking in Persons Act in 2009, trafficking in situations of forced displacement remains little identified or documented, poorly understood, and correspondingly barely addressed in current investigations, prosecutions, and convictions of trafficking offenders in Uganda. In the absence of strong data and the prevention and response mechanisms such an evidence base would enable, TIP is even more likely to flourish. So why is there such a lack of data and evidence in humanitarian contexts? You would think, on the face of it, refugee populations are often characterized by the very kinds of vulnerability that seem most likely to attract the attentions of traffickers in persons. Poverty, physical and psychological harms, weakened and broken support systems and networks. And yet, just as with that other under-documented feature of refugee populations in humanitarian context, namely experiences of conflict-related sexual violence prior to arrival, there are so many obstacles to disclosure, both by direct victims, but also by others who may have been involved in trafficking, such as parents or caretakers of children. There are also many steps to be taken in enabling disclosure, or I suspect there are many steps that generally have not yet been taken. So my question for our discussion today is, if we only knew what we were looking for and how best to do that, would we find multiple cases of trafficking in persons staring us in the face? In other words, is TIP in humanitarian contexts hidden in plain sight, either because we don't know what to look for, or because we're not even looking, or because we're asking the wrong questions, or we're asking the right questions but in the wrong way? And within those, as we discussed in preparing for this event, we also need to then dig deeper into the gender dimensions, to the gaps in identification and self-identification. And we need to look at the specific challenges arising in relation to identifying potential child victims of trafficking, or gathering data on child victims in refugee settings. So let me share my slides. So in the time available, I want to briefly present some data that we have collected from South Sudanese refugees in 3 different areas of northern Uganda, Kiriandongo, Lamwa, and Adjumani districts. Then I will also share some of the additional questions that, as a result of this project and this collaboration, we have now added to our screening tool, in the hope that we can be more proactive about identifying existing victims or those who are at risk of becoming victims of trafficking in persons. Then I'll highlight some issues on which I feel that the state of current research and documentation is so lacking that we're not even able to, we can't really formulate the right questions yet for identification purposes. And I'll close by looking at some of the risks also, that of course there are always risks if we start looking more closely. So what are some of those? The data that I want to draw on comes from screening of 4,749 South Sudanese over the period January 2018 to December 2020 for their experiences of war. That's 3,118 women and 1,631 men. We did also screen small numbers of gender non-conforming persons and a handful who did not specify their gender. But they were so small, I've kept them out of the analysis because it just makes it more complicated than it needs to be. So while we were using this data to identify cases in need of medical referral or psychosocial support as a result of untreated physical or psychological harms that led to flight or that happened during flight, when we look at that data in more depth, we can see that it also starts to sort of delineate some of the vulnerabilities that may either reflect experiences of trafficking that has already happened, but we don't know it, we haven't named it, or importantly, from a prevention perspective, can indicate vulnerabilities that make trafficking more likely. So in doing that, and because time is short, I just want to focus on two variables. The first is family composition, and the second is the reasons for flight. So this slide just shows some aspects of family composition. And what it shows is that while 95% of women and 82% of men report having one or more biological children, only 59% of the same women and 62% of the men report having all of those biological children with them in Uganda. And when the 40% of respondents, so that's 2 out of 5, who don't have some of their own children with them, when we asked them where they thought those absent children were, a staggering 42% attributed this to the children having died due to sickness or accident. 9% reported that their children were staying with other relatives. 3% that the children had disappeared. That's the bar in red that you can see down there. And 4% that they were in another country. So in other words, there are very substantial numbers of children whose exact whereabouts are unknown. And the probability that at least some of these missing, I didn't know what word to use, but these children that are not there in Uganda with their parents, the probability that some of them are victims of trafficking seems quite high. And again, on household composition, the data suggests that 67% or 2 out of 3 of the women we have screened are in single-headed households. And that's only true of 1 in 3 of the men respondents. It's also clear that women take on more responsibility for non-biological children than men. So this is a little bit complicated, but if you look at the chart on the left-hand side, the orange line represents the number of children taken on by women respondents, the blue line, those taken on by men. And then on the second side, the second half is the percentage of 2-person size households taking on non-biological children as well as their own biological children. But what it shows is, and it doesn't come across very visible, it's hard to see it in this chart, but what it shows is that those 58% of women who are in single-headed households are taking care of anywhere between 1 and 10 children, compared to only 20% of single men respondents. So we can see that there's a very big gender difference in household composition, particularly in terms of these extra children. The reasons that respondents gave us for leaving South Sudan I think serve as another proxy indicator for vulnerability, particularly when you combine them with this picture of how households are structured. 21% of women and 20% of men overall report witnessing a lack of food, having seen that, oh my God, the food is running out, and that was one of the main reasons why they fled. But when you then break it down into women who report fleeing because of lack of food, it's much more the case for those women who are in single-headed households than those who are in 2-parent households. And so there, of the women who reported that they fled because they saw that food was running out, it's 3/4 of the women who fled for that reason are in single-headed households. And those are the very same women that are taking care of larger numbers of non-biological children. So while these data don't tell us directly about confirmed cases of trafficking, what they do is alert us to the frequency of household scenarios that could reflect or enable trafficking dynamics. Missing children, taking care of many non-biological children, single-headed households where the single parent is having to care for high numbers of biological and non-biological children, and generally in conditions of extreme poverty that are reflected in that very high level of concern about the most basic of basic needs, access to food. Moving on from that, new questions that we have as a result of this collaboration with the Irish Centre for Human Rights and the Special Rapporteur, we've sort of woken up to the reality that we have just not been paying enough attention to the possibility of trafficking going on within the very families that we seek to support. So to try and address that, we have added in several new questions to our revised screening tool, and these are currently being rolled out, and we should have some good data by the end of this year. Again, I'm just going to focus on a couple of areas just to sort of just to illustrate what I'm talking about. The first set of new questions we put in is about the journey. You know, how did people actually make it from South Sudan or Sudan down to Uganda? And we have, you know, they're very basic questions, but they're questions that we were not asking in the past. Can you tell me how you came to Uganda, or where you're now living? That's for internally displaced people. If it was by a vehicle, by truck, by boat, by plane, how did you pay for it? And when you traveled, did you travel with an identity document? And if you did, did you keep hold of it, or was it taken away from you? So there, we're just trying to get sort of fairly, not very brutally, but get into questions about how was the actual journey, and are there elements of that journey which might ring alarm bells if we're concerned about trafficking. We also ask a number of questions about different forms of exploitation. I'm not going to read the whole slide, but we first ask, as we do with sexual violence, we ask people whether they've witnessed other people or being exploited. And then once we've been through that whole process, we say, would any of the things we've talked about apply to you directly? So the interviewer, the way we have set it up, the interviewer first explains that we've heard about various scenarios when some people take advantage of others' vulnerability to benefit from them. And for example, using false promises to persuade other people to move from one place to another where they can then exploit them. In other cases, they force other people or children to work without paying them and without allowing them to leave. And then, as I say, we then switch from in general to whether the person we're talking to has had direct experiences. So we've added in a number of questions. Hopefully by December, we'll have some initial data on those. I want to turn lastly to some questions we don't yet know how to ask. What happened there? And again, I want to draw a kind of comparison between our work on sexual violence in conflict and work on trafficking. So, for example, we know some of the physical symptoms that are very reliable indicators of specific forms of sexual violence, such as difficulties in sitting down for a long time, or difficulties urinating, or difficulties passing stool. But, you know, do we have indicators that we can focus in on that we're confident relate very frequently, not always, but frequently to trafficking? At a more psychological level, you know, again, with survivors of sexual violence, we know that self-isolation can be quite a powerful, reports of self-isolation are quite a powerful indicator of psychologically and psychosocially unresolved experiences of sexual violence. But do they apply equally, in equal measure to survivors of trafficking, or are there other indicators that we have yet to identify? And then lastly, some risks in what we're talking about here. Well, we need to find, I think we do need to work harder to find the trafficking that is hidden in plain sight, but we also need to be careful on several points. One is that from a response perspective, we need to be careful we don't start seeing trafficking where it's not actually happening. If we go back to the family structure issue or household structure that I talked about, of a single parent seeking to support multiple children, including non-biological ones, it might be a case of trafficking hidden in plain sight, but it could more likely turn out to be a case of that person having a very non-nuclear understanding of family, or a strong obligation to the parents of the children they're now taking care of, or a particular commitment to doing their best to protect orphans. And that said, but having said that, from a prevention perspective, and that's why I said right at the beginning, we need to look at both response and prevention, but from a prevention perspective, it might actually be those very households with very large numbers of children and single parents that are most at risk of trafficking going forward. The second point is that we need to be sure that we don't inadvertently criminalize or stigmatize informal caregivers, and therefore undermine already very highly stressed social support structures. And the third one is that we need to be careful that we don't fall into a trap of creating a hierarchy of harms that serves our purposes as interveners, activists, and let me say do-gooders, before we even have an evidence base that we can be confident of. When working on conflict-related sexual violence, we now spend so much time deconstructing a hierarchy of harms that was created by early activism that was relatively not evidenced, didn't have the full range of the evidence that was needed. I think we now need to be extremely careful that we don't create yet another under-evidenced hierarchy of harms related to trafficking that we then spend another 20 years unpicking or unpacking. You know, if 32% of parents have children, or 40% of parents have children that they say are missing due to, or died due to sickness, like, are we doing anything about that, even as we look for the other smaller percentages that people say have disappeared? To conclude, I began asking the question, if only we knew what we were looking for and how best to do that, would we find multiple cases staring us in the face? And while my remarks are intended to more to provoke a conversation than to provide a categorical answer to the question, my point is that careful analysis of our existing data, although it doesn't give us a clear picture of the full extent of trafficking in persons within forced displacement, it does suggest several possible proxy indicators for vulnerability to trafficking. And that on the basis of those indicators, refugees are very likely to be quite, trafficking is likely to be a very major feature of their experiences. The gaps in our data also highlight the importance of asking some additional questions that are more explicitly and intentionally about the forms of trafficking defined in the Palermo Protocol. And they also highlight that we don't yet have, as I said, well-developed proxy indicators for the impacts of trafficking on its victims. There isn't time in this panel to also discuss the how-to of enabling disclosure. But it's clear from the data presented here that we have a very long way to go on that score too. While the reasons for trafficking being a taboo topic are somewhat different than those related to disclosing sexual violence, I think they're just as complex. And it's just as essential that we start to try and understand those taboos if we are to get to better disclosure and the better evidence that we need. So let me stop there, and thank you very much, Siobhan.
Thank you very much, Chris. And I think that really sets a very good platform for a discussion on how do we move ahead to get to a situation where we have better evidence and better disclosure. But I think the points raised here, it's drawing from your work in the field, but it's very relevant across so many different contexts. This concern around the whereabouts of children perhaps being unknown, missing children, but not being identified or not recognized in the same way that we would identify or respond to in relation to other missing children who are not in situations of forced displacement or refugee contexts. And that's the same also in international human rights law and practice. We don't see the questions around missing children in a migration or forced displacement context coming to the fore within international human rights law practice in the way that it should. So questions around enforced or involuntary disappearances in international human rights law, or obligations of international cooperation in relation to missing children, somehow don't seem to kick in the same way, where we're talking about refugee children or children who are internally displaced. So I think that raises really important questions, but also then how do we avoid the situation where this kind of information could be misused, as you say, to identify trafficking where trafficking perhaps is not happening, where it's an extended family situation, where you have people who are looking after children who are separated from guardians, and the importance of not stigmatizing, as you said, informal caregivers. So, and that's certainly a problem in a context where we see migration increasingly being criminalized, say, speaking from the European context here, and trafficking being used as a way of further criminalizing migrant families or imposing more obstacles to movement. So I think it's really important to think about how do we build up this evidence base, because we do need to have the situation where we have better disclosure and better evidence, and it's not been kind of glossed over, but then avoiding these mistakes also, that and the misuse of information as well. I think that's really important. So thank you. We're going to move on now, and we're going to take questions and comments at the end. So if people would hold on to their questions and comments, we'll have our three speakers together and then come back to you for an open discussion, comments and questions. And we're delighted to welcome here this afternoon Michelle Koinange, who's coordinator of Stop the Traffic Kenya. And Stop the Traffic Kenya is a network of civil society organizations which fights against human trafficking in Kenya and also in the Eastern African region. Michelle is passionate about human rights and about her career advocating for human rights. Her previous work was in the corrections service, advocating for the rights of inmates and other individuals going through the criminal justice system in Kenya. So looking forward to hearing from you, Michelle. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to be speaking to all of you. So I'll pick up on what has been shared by Chris as, with regard to the gaps that we have with data. And I'll start with a story, an example that happened in 2019, where we went for a CSO forum, and civil society organizations and representatives from different parts of Africa came together and talked about how a lot of African children need support because of the cases of human trafficking in the region. When asked to talk about what a lot is, or separate it and give figures, so how many boys, how many girls, how many, what form of exploitation are these children facing, and so on and so forth, a lot of us were stuck, because for a long time, a lot has been utilized, or has been the measure that we use when talking about cases of human trafficking. Sadly, data hasn't been shared or collected, or even when it's collected, is usually reserved for our organization. So a lot of us have information and all this data, but it's for our evaluation of our project, our impact in the community, and so on and so forth. So it's rarely shared among stakeholders. Working with civil society organizations in Uganda, we, as a network in Kenya, were amazed by how they have data on human trafficking at the national level. So the government is able to share this information. It's limited to human trafficking, but they had that centralized system. So from that, we were able to pilot a few data collection and centralization systems here, but I'll talk about that as we proceed. So one of, based on what I've just shared, one of the concerns, and which is shared by other organizations globally, is that the fact that we still work in silos. We still want to protect all the data and information that we collect instead of sharing it. In a few years ago, Stop the Traffic and IBM came together and developed the Traffic Analysis Hub, which is basically a tool where we can all collect data and share it amongst ourselves. Next slide, please. So my presentation will be on how we can use technology to our advantage. Much like how we've all adjusted to life in the new normal. A lot of us would probably have to go from one place to another in order to attend meetings, but now we're in, for example, on this panel, and all of us are based in different places globally. Same thing to our data collection. We can all collect data from different parts of the world and be able to use or utilize this tool to tell the story on human trafficking and tell the story on how what human trafficking looks like in our own perspective. So what the hub does is it uses AI technology to quickly analyze volumes of data in order to be able to give the story or be able to map out the situation of human trafficking globally. The hub allows us to see human trafficking cases globally. So it allows us to look at the global maps, to look at all our countries, and then look at the number of cases of human trafficking we have. It also, which allows us to see hotspot areas within the around the world. It also allows us to see the routes that most victims of trafficking end up using. It also allows us to have a global perspective, because sometimes, and this I go back to what I mentioned earlier, when we internalize and store this data to ourselves, it looks like we're working by ourselves, like there's no other partner working on this giant that is human trafficking or this giant that is migration issues. But when we share this information, we're able to actually see the amount of work and the amount of resources and time that is going into combating human trafficking globally. Next slide, please. So how does this work? It starts by step one. It's a 4-step process. The first step is data collection. I'll take a step back and talk about what happened in Kenya. In 2019, as I mentioned, after a lot of meetings where we kept on talking about the very, very many Kenyans who are victims of human trafficking, and a lot of them end up in XYZ destination and so on and so forth, we realized that we need to use the resources that we already have in order to tell the story of the Kenyan victims of human trafficking. So different CSOs came together and collected the data they've based on victims they've supported in the organizations for the last, I think, 10 years. They looked at that data, put it together, and were able to tell the story. They were able to map out the hotspot areas. They were able to tell the cases, the percentage of cases of human trafficking, whether it was international cases or domestic trafficking, and so on and so forth, based on coming together and just putting all this data into one centralized system. So the same thing happens with the trafficking analysis hub. It's usually we as authenticated partners. So an authenticated partner is you and I. That means civil society organizations, law enforcement, private sector. So private sector could be businesses, could be finance institutions such as banks, because we all know that a lot of cases of human trafficking lead to quote unquote profit. So the people who actually financially benefit from the buying and selling of human beings, or exploitation of human beings, sorry. So by submitting our information, or by expressing our interest to join the trafficking analysis hub, or by you expressing your interest to join this hub, you go through a process and then become an authenticated partner. This allows you to share the data you collect. A lot of the questions as we got when we started out and on the Kenyan side was, well, we are a grassroots organization. We use the old filing system. We don't use digital methods of data collection. We don't have the tech to do what you're sharing. A lot of the times, the assumption that this, by looking at the trafficking analysis hub, the assumption is that this is a technical platform and there's no way I can plug into it if I use analog bases or systems of data collection. So this is just to assure you that even if you're using an old filing system or a non-digital filing system, you can feel free to still share this information, and this information still goes into the hub and still goes into painting the global picture of the situation of human trafficking. Next. So as I mentioned earlier, this and I'm sure the IT and the tech people within our audience would probably understand this better, but the artificial intelligence IBM Watson is one that receives all this information and then sorts it out. So you've let's say 100 organizations within the region have keyed in or put in data or given data on, let's say each has given one person or information about on one person. That's 100 people's information which is keyed in. This system allows all this information to be kind of disaggregated and put and utilized in or placed in its proper state. So for example, we've all given information on 100 people. So out of these 100 people, there are probably 10 men and 90 women, or 80 and 20 and so on and so forth. This allows it to sift through very fast and then map out this information almost at a real-time state. Next, sorry. So the analysis and output. Again, the system, the traffic analysis hub does not just give information on the maps and the routes and the countries and so forth. It goes into detail. So for example, the industry of exploitation, it gives data on what on what forms of exploitation people go through and what industry exploits them. They face this exploitation in. So for example, agriculture or transport and so on and so forth, and what means of transport was utilized during the exploitation and so on and so forth. So again, the system takes the raw data that you give and puts it through and refines it to a point where when you look at the map or when you look at the trafficking analysis hub, you can easily filter out what data you want. For example, if you go on the hub right now and you want to get statistics from 2020 and want to look at people who are exploited globally or in the field of agriculture, it's easy to go through and see and identify and point this out. And it's easier for us, for example, for us to actually have better or more informed points of programming. So it allows us to be able to refine our responses. Next. I think I jumped the gun because the next part is the use and impact. So the structured and unstructured data is then processed and analyzed, and then gives us the opportunity to program or to implement our projects from a different perspective. So we go back to the first conversation where it was a lot of children have been exploited in Africa, and a lot of them are victims of human trafficking. But when you break it down and look at it as, oh yeah, so it was 50% boys of a certain age and 30% girls of a certain age and 20% so on and so forth, you're able to look at, so that's the African context. What does that look like in Uganda, in Kenya? Can we look at this information and these numbers and use them to influence our decision, our activities? Or can we decide, for example, we have a new year coming and I'm sure a lot of us are working on our work plans for 2022. Can we sit down and look at data to inform our planning and our programming instead of, oh, we always work in this community and our work in this community is what sadly sometimes pays the bills, or that is what our donor wants us to work on and so on and so forth. But are we actually having the impact that we intend to have? Are we actually reaching out and meeting the people who need our assistance most? Next. So out of all this, and I hope that this is what we take home, is our common goal is sharing data in order to stop human trafficking. And again, I'll go back to the perspective of, are we still planning our activities based on this is how we've always done it, or are we evaluating our impact? Are we looking at data. For example, if you have implemented a project in one community for the last 20 years, have you looked at is this community better off in these, have you impacted it to a point where you can actually see and track the improvement of in this community? Can you see levels of growth, or can you be honest and look at some of the activities you've implemented and see that, oh yeah, we thought this activity was amazing, but based on the numbers and the figures that we're getting, it's actually not impacting our target audience as such. So could we go back to the drawing board and sit down and evaluate our impact and our strategy, so that we can have a better response and a better outcome in the next, let's say, 5 years. Next slide. So I know I've gone through, I've just given a broad overview of the Trafficking Analysis Hub, but you can still get more details about it by requesting a demo. So it's the demo is 8 minutes or 9 minutes long, so it's not too long, and you can just go through the system and see whether it's something that you'd be willing to plug into or be willing to share your data to, and whether it's something you actually would want to participate in. And if you do agree to, or if you want to join the Trafficking Analysis Hub and join this, I don't say a movement, but this conversation, or this platform where data is shared this freely, you can also click on the link here and join us. And all of this is available on the Traffic Analysis Hub. And I think I am done. I'm sorry for going a bit over my time, but yeah, that is the last slide.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And I think that follows on very well from Chris's presentation as well, so here we're looking at the Trafficking Analysis Hub and how it can inform your work in civil society and in coordination in terms of programming and planning, better responses, and thinking about where you're working, which sectors, and what are the possible points of helpful intervention, thinking about the different modes of transport, for example, that you mentioned. But also, I guess we need to think about how is this data being gathered, and how can we ensure that it is reliable, that it is safe for people to engage, and what happens to the data? How do we ensure the privacy and protection of those engaging as well? So I think that raises a lot of very interesting questions, particularly in situations of forced displacement, refugee settings, conflict or post-conflict settings, or in the context of natural disasters, for example, where all kind of questions may arise as to how this data is used and gathered, and at the same time, how can it be used in a good way to try and make the responses more meaningful and more timely also. So thank you very much for that, Michelle, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions on that. So we're going to move on now to our third and last speaker, Andrea Kenny. Andrea has been working with mobile, marginalized and crisis affected populations for more than 15 years. Predominantly with IOM, the International Organization for Migration, and she has also held positions with a range of NGOs, including CARE and the Red Cross, and working in private research in her home country of Canada. She's worked in a range of emergency operations in Rwanda, Kenya, South Sudan, Somalia, Libya, and Myanmar, and is very familiar from that work with displacement contexts and with common humanitarian response systems. She's currently leading the counter-trafficking in emergencies team at IOM headquarters in Geneva, and co-leading the Global Protection Cluster's anti-trafficking task team, along with UNHCR. So she's drawing on a range of different frontline experiences working with affected populations, including victims of trafficking and other forms of violence and abuse. She has temporarily hung up her PPE and radio and is providing technical support to field operations, also conducting trainings for protection actors on identifying and responding to trafficking in persons in situations of forced displacement. So really delighted to have Andrea joining us today. And we've had very good cooperation with the Global Protection Cluster's anti-trafficking task team in previous events also, and they are doing really important work in trying to break down the different kinds of silos in which we sometimes work. So this is really important work, and delighted to have you. Over to you, Andrea.
Thank you very much. Suddenly that bio sounded a lot longer once I heard it read out loud. Sorry for that. So thank you very much, Special Rapporteur, and to the Refugee Law Project for hosting us. Greetings to my fellow panelists and to all of our colleagues online. I'm very honored to be part of this event. As mentioned, I work for IOM, but as a really short background, I'm here representing the anti-trafficking task team, as was mentioned, which sits within the Global Protection Cluster, which is a system that is mandated to coordinate non-refugee humanitarian emergencies, so internal displacement. I realize this is organized by the Refugee Law Project, but while the legal aspects may differ somewhat, the fundamental operations of both internal and cross-border displacement are really not vastly different, and neither would our approaches to trafficking differ very much. Our task team is co-led by IOM and UNHCR and has about 20 member organizations, NGOs and UN agencies. At the country level, they typically involve more NGOs, national NGOs, and usually are co-led with the government, an arm of local government as well. I can certainly talk more about those working groups, but in the interest of time, I'll just get right to the subject matter for now. Where are we here? So the concept of, are we still on the front page? First slide is fine. That's okay there. The concept of human trafficking in crisis contexts, whether this is a crisis or natural disaster or economic instability or even a pandemic, is still often considered to be quite new or a niche concept. I'm pretty sure trafficking in situations of displacement has existed for a very long time, but it's really only in the past, I'm going to guess 5, maybe 10 years that as a humanitarian community, we've given it really any focus at all. But to be honest, even just a couple of years ago when I came into this role, we still had to advocate, even among protection actors, for the fact that anti-trafficking work does indeed have a place in humanitarian response, and that it can be considered a critical life-saving activity. Sorry, next slide, if you can go to the first slide. Great. Actually, and also the next slide as well. Apologies for that. Great. There is generally a lack of awareness among humanitarian workers about what human trafficking is, what would count as trafficking as per the prevailing definition, and simply put, what trafficking would look like in situations of displacement. Okay, so it is through our interaction with country level operations as well as discussions with trainings that we continue to hear examples of trafficking and the challenges in identifying and documenting victims. I will talk a little bit about identification of cases, but after that, I do want to highlight the challenges in reporting onwards, whether this is verified case data or general trends or even anecdotal evidence. I would say the challenge of reporting is possibly a major reason why we think we don't have data on trafficked people in displacement settings, but I'll come back to that. Next slide, please. So much actually similar to what Dr. Dolan described, we rely heavily on proxy indicators, and we recommend doing this. This means that we never ask directly, is human trafficking happening here? Because the answer is almost always no, or I don't know. This is the same whether we are asking a displaced person or another humanitarian worker. People just don't know what trafficking is for the most part, and we don't get a lot of useful information this way. When we focus on particular types of exploitation, if and when it's appropriate to ask, then we start to get a different picture. We can ask about, here's the list here, some of the indirect questions. We can ask about job offers from recruiters, forced labor or hazardous labor that's nearby, people coming into the camp and offering marriage or educational opportunities abroad. We can ask about the general availability of commercial sex, the use of child soldiers, the acceptability, broadly speaking, of child labor. And while none of these examples verify cases, we know that any of these offenses could actually amount to trafficking or be a risk of trafficking. Next slide, please. There, good. Further, we can piece together risk of exploitation by triangulating factors such as household composition, which was mentioned earlier, economic dependency, livelihoods, opportunities, or lack thereof. Sometimes people are not even permitted to work legally where they are displaced. Proximity to manual labor industries such as agriculture, mining, the presence of armed groups, including, unfortunately, international peacekeepers. Low school attendance or no access to education altogether, which is typically seen as an immediate risk of children to child labor and possible trafficking. And all of this combined with disrupted community support networks such as separation from extended families. Further to that, this can also be compared with other data that is collected regularly, such as routine hospital reports or statistics, on sexual assault, injuries related to violence or accidents on the job, as well as separate from the hospital. We could also take a look at the influx or outflow of people from the displacement site. So in most of these environments, either IOM or UNHCR does monitor the general population. With IOM, these are called FMS or flow monitoring surveys. Now, almost all of this information that I just described is already collected through registration exercises. Sorry, next slide, please. Registration exercises, household surveys, protection monitoring, vulnerability screening, and just regular humanitarian assessments. And so while none of these, again, alone confirm cases of trafficking or any exact numbers, it can still provide insight into the presence and likely types of exploitation. And one has to consider as well, so in displacement settings where people are already over-assessed and there are concerns about respondent fatigue, the ethics of asking personal questions without offering additional solutions, it's typically not necessary to launch full primary data collection to know if trafficking is happening. It might be a matter of a trained eye performing additional analysis on existing data or using a trafficking perspective. We'll stay there for a moment. So why do we struggle anyway to identify victims, or why do they not present themselves? There are many reasons that we can speculate about, such as fear, threats, stigma, not knowing where to go, not trusting the help that might be there. But I actually will play a bit of devil's advocate here and say that in fact, many victims do come forward. They just won't present themselves as a victim of trafficking per se. Next slide, please. Maybe that's not the most useful part. Well, anyway. They might surface during a medical appointment, during group outreach sessions or counseling sessions, again, registration, surveys that focus on the household demographic or livelihoods, when they are counseled on possibilities to return to their area of origin. There should be vulnerability screening during best interest determination processes for children, where all angles of their vulnerability should be assessed, or they could just directly approach a frontline worker. This can happen. But we also have to consider the humanitarian workers who are receiving this information. They might be a social worker or a nurse or a counselor who might be better equipped to act on it. But very likely they're going to be a frontlines operations officer who also covers shelter and water and sanitation. And they might report to a field officer or a field leader who is middle, maybe low-level management. And by default, they cover all protection considerations because protection, broadly speaking, is supposed to be mainstreamed across every sector. So they might find themselves faced with the person who has clear protection needs. They need some kind of support. That worker might know what to do to give them the immediate care, but they might not know to explore further or to classify this person as a potential case of trafficking. Especially when, if, for example, there's a person who is identified as a victim of sexual violence, and the worker has reason to suspect that they might also be a victim of trafficking, there might not be a sense of urgency to confirm that they were trafficked if that person is already receiving care and support services. So in these cases, the frontline workers and even those who receive referrals, the first stage of referral of protection cases, they do have to question from an ethical standpoint, is there value in putting a person or a victim through yet another layer or a set of questions that might be intrusive or re-traumatizing or injuring them further if we are unable or unlikely to be able to offer them more support than what they are already getting. And we have to consider as well, is it worth it for the victim, but also our own safety and resources to do this so that we can classify another level of victimhood. Now, typically in trainings and discussions, we would advocate that yes, it's worth it. It is worth it because there might be additional provisions available to that person. There might be additional protective measures available to that person. So we would generally recommend. But if we don't have the support in place to then act on it, it might not be the right time to explore further. It might not be ethical to take it further. As I go on here, I want to be careful. I'm not suggesting that we do have a ton of data on trafficking that we're just not using, but our lack of information does go beyond the question of individuals coming forward or even just the political will of organizations to identify them. There's a lot of complications. How are we for time here? Okay, moving on to the question of reporting. Let me just see what slide you're on. Next slide, please. Sorry, I didn't give you the one more. Sorry, that was the opportunities where they might present themselves. Next slide about important reporting channels. Okay. One of the other reasons that we often advocate that we do identify victims and classify them as such, even if they are already being supported for other experiences or offenses, is that there are larger reporting processes that we could feed into that in theory would have consequences, whether it's sanctions or economic sanctions, asset freezing, indictment. There's a lot of things that could, in theory, could be triggered. It might not help that individual in question, but it would therefore impact the entire trafficking issue. Again, it's hypothetical. So some of these examples are the Department of State, the US Department of State annual TIP report, which designates tier status, which has implications for bilateral funding. There's the Child Soldiers Prevention Act or CSPA list, which is contained in the TIP report and also impacts the provision of military support to countries who are on this list. There is Security Council Resolution 1612 and the grave violations against children, none of which on their own would definitively count as trafficking necessarily, but most of which could amount to trafficking or contribute to it in some way. And that requires the MRM or monitoring and reporting mechanism. And lastly, I'll mention the Security Council Resolution 1960 on conflict-related sexual violence, and the MARA reporting, which is the monitoring, analysis, and reporting arrangements. So a lot of these reporting mechanisms do exist, and they might actually be very robust and functional, but many organizations and even countrywide international responses simply don't know how to report safely into these channels. Next slide, please. So some of the reasons that we don't report into these broader channels. This is the list of reporting. Next slide, please. Is that often maybe the victim just doesn't want to, and sometimes they can't articulate to us why they don't want to take a report forward, but we have to respect their wish in some cases and just leave it there. They get the medical care that they need, maybe the psychosocial support, but they don't want to take it further. There may be a very real fear of retaliation, stigmatization, isolation, and exclusion from communities, social punishment. But even more so, we have to be really careful in among populations that might practice something like an honor killing. And if the information comes back to the victim's family, they could be at serious risk. People often don't trust the promise of confidentiality. There are concerns with mandatory reporting, which is, for those who don't know, it's when you are in a position where if you receive information, you are obligated by your job, perhaps ethically as well, to break confidentiality and report onwards in the interest of supporting that person or protecting others. Another one, yes, there's fear that the information will go back to the victim's family or even directly to the perpetrator. In some places, support, this should not be the case, but sometimes support from national services is contingent upon cooperation with an investigation and eventual prosecution. And sometimes people just would rather not go to that point. One more reason I'll just mention here is that sometimes we have difficulty meeting the reporting criteria. So we have had recent examples from West Africa, broadly speaking, where there were reports of the use of child soldiers. They wanted to report this into Security Council Resolution 1612, but could not verifiably link the offenses to the particular armed group. And so the information stopped short of getting to the bigger arena. Last slide is the solutions. Or some suggested actions, sorry. I'll just list some of these. Training and awareness, visibility and advocacy, a review of reporting mechanisms and their true level of security, maybe any gaps or loopholes there that cause concern for people, a review of our ability to protect whistleblowers and victims from retaliation. And I'm really glad that Michelle mentioned this about data sharing. This is probably one of our biggest issues, is that there are some data sharing agreements, but they're just not universal enough. And even within organizations, sometimes between departments, we have trouble sharing information because of data protection agreements and just the fear that we're not sure how to do this the right way. And without this, the information cannot be channeled upwards to the Security Council or even the ICC level. I'll stop there. I think I've hit the 15-minute mark and beyond, so I'll take a breather. Ready for questions though?
Thank you very much. That was really helpful and I think really important. Also highlighting actions that can be taken and steps that can be taken to move forward. And I would be interested to hear more whether you're seeing significant changes in practice from what you said was some years ago, where we see a real compartmentalization of responses and a lack of awareness of how to identify or refer people for protection who may be victims of trafficking or at heightened risk, and to ensure that that is actually that information and awareness and those kinds of skills are becoming more embedded in humanitarian responses. I guess just to give a quick example from my own work as Special Rapporteur in relation to the conflict situation in Tigray, for example, we found it very difficult to get information in relation to potential risks of trafficking or to get any engagement from those on the ground. Yet, I think what you identified, Andrea, in many ways as proxy indicators, many of those are present, but it's still really difficult to see whether or not there are risks of trafficking or whether that might be happening. We did send communications to both Ethiopia and Eritrea, and those are public now, and the responses, and that was led by the Special Rapporteur on the rights of internally displaced persons, and really just tried to highlight the risks arising. But it still seems to be quite difficult to gather that kind of information and data and to really feed it on upwards into programming and planning as well. So we have about 20 minutes for questions, discussion. I'm going to open it up to attendees or panelists for follow-up questions or comments. Is there anyone that would like to kick off with a question to an individual panelist or to any of the, or to the panel as a whole, or comments are also very welcome. You can raise your hand, I think, or put a question in the chat. And Chris is going to kick off. Chris, please, yeah.
Thanks, I got in there very quickly, but thanks for the great presentations. One question with, and I think you raised it, Siobhan, as well, is when you're, and this is for Michelle, when you're gathering all that different data and putting it into some kind of hub, how do you check the quality of it? And because the quality of what goes in affects the quality of what comes out, as we know. So that one, it would be great to hear more about that. And And then for Andrea, I think there are so many kind of connections between your presentation and my own. And I suppose my question is, as you said, the data is being collected, but is it providing any insight? And if the data is there in routine surveys, in all sorts of routine data that is being collected, who's actually sitting and looking through it as proxy indicators of trafficking? Because I think that's the gap, actually, is that, yeah, there is data, but what is the lens that is being used when it comes to analyzing that data? And that is such a challenge in so many other similar kind of taboo topics, is that there is, if you know what to look for, you can find all sorts of very suggestive evidence. But if you haven't got the right lens, it's just mounds and mounds of data. And then the second question, also for Andrea, if I may, is if you're the global protection cluster and you don't deal with refugees, who does? Because if UNHCR are also on the global protection cluster, but you didn't say that that makes you deal with refugees. So who exactly in these global structures is dealing with that? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll go straight back then. Maybe Michelle, if you want to respond, and then Andrea can respond to that quickly as well. Thank you.
Thank you, but I think Andrea had also lifted up her hand. So, okay, that's okay.
But go ahead.
Awesome. Thank you. So the authentication process, right now it's rooted towards the authentication of the organization. So, for example, let me give like what happened in Kenya with what has been happening in Kenya with our data collection here. It's we, as Siobhan mentioned during the introduction, I'm from Stop the Traffic Kenya, which is a network of civil society organizations. So the data we use in our centralized system is from our member organizations. So by that virtue, we look at it as valid data based on the people who they've engaged or who have engaged their organizations. The problem comes in, and I think I hope that this is something we can resolve with time, is sometimes due to the limited amount of services, especially protection services that victims have, one individual could end up going to 5 different organizations for services. So they go to organization A and get health medical checkup, so they're evaluated and so on and so forth. And then they go to organization B and get psychosocial support. Organization C gives them shelters and so on and so forth. So at the end of the day, sometimes, or in and this is a gap we've noticed in both mapping exercises we've done here, is this one individual could end up being counted 10 times based on the fact that they visited 10 different organizations to get services after rescue. So I wouldn't say that it's 100% foolproof, but it's a problem that we are cognizant of and are trying to kind of resolve. Yeah. I hope that covers it. And then also another source of information for the hub is bulletins globally. So information that is in our national dailies and our regional dailies, for example, the East African and the Nation that you shared. So all that is also flagged by the artificial intelligence and then also goes into feeding into this hub.
Okay, that's really interesting. Thank you very much. Yeah, the whole question around the role of AI, artificial intelligence, in analyzing data, gathering it, identifying indicators. I think that's continuing to be quite significant. We'll come back to you again, I'm sure. Andrea, just to follow up perhaps on Chris's question around who is looking at trafficking in the context of refugee groups and communities.
Right, these are good questions. So there's the general humanitarian response is typically broken into two realms, even though it's not always quite that clear cut. Internal displacement is the interagency standing committee cluster response, and then the refugee response is always managed by UNHCR. And we would have very typical sub-working groups on different topics such as shelter or water or what have you. In the day-to-day work, honestly, I don't feel, I might get myself into hot water here, I don't feel like the actual operational work is very different in either place, but it is structured differently, and the reporting and the ultimate accountability is a little bit different. But UNHCR is for refugees 100% of the time. The other question, which was really good, was about who is looking at these proxy indicators or these routine, household surveys that we do anyway to know if we have enough materials and whatnot, and distributions and all these things. Typically, it would be information management officers. So these are people who may or may not have a background in research or epidemiology. Some people kind of fall into this work because they were already front lines, or they were doing very frontline data collection, like they were enumerators for something else, and they kind of just stayed where they were. Others have more expertise, but across the board, most do not have a background in trafficking or very much knowledge about it. This is hopefully changing. We've just produced quite a lot of material on exactly this, counter trafficking in emergencies for information management officers, and we have some information about that in our task team introductory guidance as well. But I think we're just at the beginning of it, really. And this is also a question of mainstreaming protection across everything. A lot of the people who use information management officers are expected to just know protection work as well, and they might not have come from that realm. So we're still kind of in the beginning phases, I would say, in some areas. Some have jumped ahead quite far already.
Okay, that's really helpful. And again, those are the kinds of actors that we don't always think about in terms of anti-trafficking action and programming, to think about the information managers and really building capacity there, and ensuring that they're actually directly involved in these discussions also, because that's critically important then in terms of, as Chris said, what also comes out of the analysis and how is it fed upwards and outwards as well in terms of planning and responses. Okay, I'm going to open it up again for any other questions or comments. If we have anyone from UNHCR, it would be great to hear from you as well. And I know we also have Rachel Bikole from the Office of the DPP in Uganda, and Rachel was also going to comment, I think, or might have a question. Rachel, did you want to join? If you turn on your microphone video. Hi, thanks.
Good evening. I'm really glad to be part of this webinar, and I'm very grateful for the organization. It's unfortunate I joined a bit late because of some technical issues, but thank God I'm here now. Thank you. Well, thank you for the great discussions, and it's been fantastic. Again, like you said, my name is Rachel Bihole. I am an assistant director in the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions. I also head the trafficking in persons in the Office of the DPP. And as we commemorate the World Day Against Trafficking, the Office of DPP is very honored to be partnering with a few agencies that are interested or that prioritize trafficking in persons. And we have a few highlights of what our office has done so far, particularly in respect to persons, or I'll say refugees or persons in situations of forced displacement. When we look at ODPP, we have registered an increase in the number of cases of trafficking in persons investigated and prosecuted. Since January to date, to June, we have so far arrested and prosecuted 512 cases of trafficking in persons. The only challenge I must say is that we are still segregating data in respect of these cases to determine which of those are cases found, are cases particularly relating to refugees and the like. It is something that we embarked on in the month of April. And then we also have about 16 regions in the country that have our offices. And in those 16 regions in the country, we have trained the attorneys, we have trained the regional heads, to ensure that when cases of trafficking, to ensure that they properly identify and charge cases of trafficking in persons. And in addition to properly identifying these cases and charging, we have also emphasized to segregate data in relation to cases of refugees, cases of sexual exploitation, cases of children who are found in situations of trafficking. So it is something that we have embarked on that we believe it's going to give us tremendous results. And as a country, we're not happy that we have been ranked in a tier 2 watch list for the second time. And we're really trying to make every effort that we can to get better, at least to, with a target of getting to tier 2 and then eventually tier 3. Secondly, we still have the challenge of not having a law on witness protection and victim protection. It is still a bill, but with the new management, we are trying to push for the passing of this bill into the law, because we believe that when we have a law on witness and victim protection, it can help us to handle the issues relating to victims, particularly when we look at the theme for their survivor voices leading all the way. It means it's an issue that we really need to focus on and give attention to. And then besides that, another challenge that we are grappling with is the issue of cases taking so long in the system. So we believe that fast tracking of these cases is really key and important, such that we avoid re-traumatization of the victims or the survivors. And as the Office of the DPP alone, we cannot do this. That's why we believe that such partnerships and coordinations with you can help us in as far as addressing these challenges. But among the areas we are looking at, we have plea bargain, we have special sessions, and right now we are partnering with the SGBV department to have our cases first heard. We are looking at dispensing justice, but at the same time, we are losing a lot of data because our cases are captured as SGBV cases as opposed to trafficking cases. But because we're desperate for justice to be dispensed at the earliest, that's why we're doing that. But it's an issue that I bring forward and say would seek for partnership, for coordination, and see that maybe trafficking cases are given due attention and we fast track them. And then we have also put focal persons. We have appointed focal persons to be in each of the refugee resettlement areas where we have field offices. So these will be in charge of one, identifying the cases, properly charging the cases, and then also reporting the cases to us and also keeping data to us. Because data is also another thing that we are still grappling with. Because we believe that it's important for us to have accurate data. What we report is not so accurate compared to the workload that is on the ground. Thank you very much. Briefly, that's what I heard from the Office of the DPP. I'm very glad to be part of this very important webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. And thank you. We're always very happy to have the engagement with the Office of the DPP and also to hear that work that is ongoing specifically in relation to engaging with refugee settlements as well. And as you say, the difficulties in terms of gathering accurate data and information as well. And part of the discussion that we've had is around safe disclosure and reporting mechanisms as well. So there are some questions coming into the chat there, and I can see Andrea has been answering some live, but perhaps Andrea, I could ask you maybe to comment on those as they will be of wider interest also, particularly in relation to the levels of mandatory reporting protocols and practices in different countries, and also the methodologies of interviewing, of gathering documentation and identification as well. Thanks. Thank you.
Unmute myself. Sure. So one of the first questions was about talking, like you said, more about mandatory reporting protocols in some of other countries that we have worked in. And this definitely varies from country to country, but it is quite a common thing to have some level of mandatory reporting, most especially when it involves children, but not always. So the most obvious examples or immediate examples I can think of would be medical professionals who receive a victim of some kind of violation, very often sexual violations. They are typically, but not always, required by law to report to authorities. They can't just sit and keep, put that in their own records and keep quiet. this varies across the type of offense and from country to country, but this is not unusual. It's not always the actual law itself. There's often just the assumption that something like that will happen. So oftentimes people are afraid to report because they think maybe that person will be obligated to report. Some people are afraid that their information is going to go straight to their government, which is not a crazy idea actually, because these often go into broader national indicators, like I don't know what you call it, but so it's not always that they know for a fact their information will be channeled forward. They just worry that it will be, and we can't always guarantee. Otherwise, we often don't know. That information might not be online, and if we don't have a person who can speak to the national context, you can't guarantee that. The other question was about methodology. If the choice of methodology is one of the dilemmas we're struggling with when it comes to data collection. I'm not sure if I actually answered this properly. I went on a bit of a tirade here, but it's not just I think most of our information management officers, they do have at least minimal trainings in ethics and do no harm and proper methodologies, even if they're not doing massive research studies as their regular job. But it's not just the methodology, it's the timing, and it's especially what we plan to do with this information. I think quite often there is a gathering without a clear plan of what you intend to do with the data that comes forward, or even how it will be analyzed. Is this a report that's going to go to donors? I'm speaking very practical level here. Is this a report that stays within the organization? Are we using it to inform our responses, or are we just sort of putting the feelers out to see what comes back and then we decide how to work with it? In theory, we are more organized than that, but I don't think this is always the case. So when it comes to sensitive topics like this, we have to really take a step back and not just the methodology, but really plan what is the intended use for this information.
Great, thank you very much. Chris, I wonder, would you like to comment on those questions also? And we also have another question from Patricia Hines, which I think is relevant to this discussion around what form is the existing data in that is being gathered, and the complexities of putting together the different pieces of the jigsaw and the delays that then can arise. So how to manage with that. I'm just wondering, in terms of the work that Refugee Law Project is now doing in terms of adding questions into the screening process, how do you find, what are the difficulties around analysing that or gathering that data and responding to it?
Yeah, thanks, Siobhan. I liked Patricia's question, and I think that some of the language that you're sharing there is where people are used. They have what I would describe almost as coded language. It's like codes to describe particularly bad situations where the person doesn't tell you all the gory details, but that's the kind of thing where if we know what we're listening for, we can see that stuff that we thought was hidden is actually there in plain sight. But that's exactly the point about this discussion, is like, do we know the codes? What are the specific codes that relate specifically to situations of trafficking, such as kept in rooms? I think that's such an interesting example. I think the question of how you get from people telling you stuff and disclosing, even if it's indirectly, to action is it's a very interesting one. And for us, with our screening, we try to make that connection quite immediate, so that when you screen somebody, it is for the purpose of finding those alarm bells and saying, okay, well, if you've told me this and this and this, does that mean you're looking for this and a number of different types of support? And we're resourced to respond to people's search for support. But it is a tricky one. And I think earlier we said, should you ask questions if you don't have any support to offer? And it does become a chicken and egg question. If you don't really know the extent of the problem, you don't get the resources to respond to it. And so then you don't ask any questions about it, and you don't understand the dimension of the problem. So somehow we have to find a way through that. And I think that's where the question of proxy indicators is actually is part of a strategic approach to getting through that chicken and egg, breaking out of the chicken and egg cycle. Because if we can identify useful proxy indicators where the data is being collected under another heading, then we cut through some of that conundrum. So yeah, I think that would be part of my answers. I think Opira Bosco Okot asked an interesting question about how do we make an ordinary person understand incidents of trafficking, and I think this goes to my point earlier about we need to be very careful that we're not, sort of jumping to framing situations in ways that make sense to us without having understood does the situation, how are the people involved in it making sense of it, and how do parents and caretakers taking care of lots of children, many children of deceased siblings and so on, how do they deal with situations where they literally don't know what they're going to put on the table, and then somebody comes and offers a way of which appears to help them to keep these children alive? Are they then complicit in trafficking, or are they just as much victims of the situation? So there's a lot that I think we need to think around there. But at the same time, I think it is a bit like the discussion around sexual violence, because it's a taboo topic, because people know that, I mean, we've discussed the risks of stigmatization. I mean, you have to, at some point, you have to start opening up the conversation, and that there are a number of ways in which we do that around sexual violence, in terms of, it could be through community information sessions, it could be in joint community policing sessions, it could be through putting together short video clips that we can screen in a community as a way of catalyzing and opening up a discussion. So there are a number of different ways, and I think that's quite urgent, because as far as I'm aware, that has not yet really been done certainly within the settings that we're working with. Thanks.
Great. David, you had a question or comment, please?
Oh yeah, thank you so very much, Yvonne. I do have a question, just to follow up from Michelle. I was struck by Michelle's response to Chris' question. The question of how then do we ensure that quality is punched in so that we can get quality at the outputs level, and what I heard Michelle saying is artificial intelligence is in the main one of those quality assurance mechanism. So talking about trafficking, and having heard about proxy questions and the difficulties of disclosure, so I want to ask Michelle to tell us a little more. How do we make artificial intelligence intelligent enough about these difficulties in disclosure, and even more interestingly, the awareness of how to deal with this proxy question? Because if the question to the artificial intelligence system is not as direct as it comes, how do we then navigate very interesting areas of subtleties that come with the very nature of the crime we are talking about? I just don't think I would look forward to seeing an intelligent artificial intelligence that is subtle enough, and how are they making for that shortcoming? Thank you.
Thank you, David. And I think what you're highlighting also are the potential risks around this, but also then as the question that we discussed earlier around putting together different pieces of the jigsaw in a timely way, but also in a sensitive and responsive way. Michelle, did you want to come in there and respond? And then we also have a question to Rachel, if you're still with us and would be willing to comment on whether or not the Office of the DPP is planning to work with immigration officers at border points, so specifically at border crossings, in the same way that you're planning and are working in refugee settlements. Thank you. I'll come back to you first, Michelle. Thanks.
Awesome, thank you. So I will not go into the nitty-gritty of artificial intelligence and how to make them intelligent and so on, because thankfully the Trafficking Analysis Hub is actually developed with, in partnership with IBM, who are, as we all know, global experts on this on the subject. But based on what you just asked, I think I'll look at it from the perspective of how can we leverage our expertise, because the artificial intelligence is only as I'd use your words, intelligent as our information. So what questions are we asking? What data are we feeding into it? What direction? How are we molding the conversation for it? Because again, it's not going to, the system has not been developed to focus on human trafficking, on human trafficking, and then suddenly 2 weeks or 2 years down the line, it starts talking about shopping, for example. I know it's very contrast. So just by that, its intelligence is highly dependent on us. So even if it's way advanced and it's very superior when it comes to technology, it's still quite limited to how much information will we share, how will we grow it, what parameters are given to it, and so on and so forth. So it is intelligent, but again, it's still dependent on us as human beings and us as practitioners in this sector of human trafficking. But again, I will not go into too much detail because the experts from the tech side are the ones who would probably better answer that and go into more detail about that.
And Andrea, can I ask, is this something that the Global Protection Cluster and the Anti-Trafficking Task Team, do you engage with the tech sector, or is it part of the discussion in looking at those kind of ways of data gathering, or setting up larger hubs, or how AI can be used or not used? Is that an ongoing conversation?
We are definitely not there yet, and certainly not with AI. There has been some communication with Tech Against Trafficking. I'm not sure if people are familiar with this NGO. It's still sort of in the, from the task team perspective, a nascent discussion at best. If I can remove the hat for a second and just speak as IOM, the conversation has gone a little further. And even outside of IOM, actually, I've witness to some other examples of things like the banking sector, or I mean there's a lot of things going on that could be used to sort of see where trafficking does touch down eventually, but from our task team perspective, we're definitely not at that point for an internal displacement context anyway.
Yeah, so there's certainly a lot of work going on in relation to financial flows and monitoring that. Much of that seems to be around the investigation and prosecution concerns rather than prevention or protection of the human rights of victims so much. So it's also part of the context that needs to be looked at, but not so much focused on a kind of victim-centered approach. Rachel, would you be able to comment on the question we have here in the chat in relation to the DPP working at border crossings or border points, if you're there, in relation to identifying potential victims of trafficking? We're not hearing you, Rachel. Are you? Oh, hi. Thanks, Rachel.
Sorry.
It's okay.
Yeah, thank you, Shaban, for the question. Yes, I think I must just confirm that the Office of the DPP has always been working together with the border agents. We have what we call the Coordination Office of the Prevention of Trafficking in Persons Act, the COPTIP, commonly known as the COPTIP. We always have monthly meetings where possible. And this COPTIP, the Coordination Office, comprises of various ministries and agencies, and also civil society organizations. So the ministries, we have Ministry of Internal Affairs, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Gender, Labor and Social Development. We have the Attorney General's Office. So it's so we all come together as different ministries and agencies and civil society organizations in putting efforts together towards combating trafficking in persons. And the Directorate of Immigration is that's where the border agents fall. We always work with them because they are very key in identification of persons or victims of trafficking. And actually, they've done a lot of rescue of most of the victims of trafficking. And usually at border points, we also have the police. So the border agents work together hand in hand with the police as well. So these are very, very, very key in identifying victims of trafficking, or in trying to intercept the traffickers and also the victims. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Rachel. Thank you for that. Just to clarify the work ongoing at the border crossings as well. But of course, that raises very specific questions, I think, around challenges of identification and documentation in those kinds of settings where disclosure and reporting, I think, can be particularly challenging and pose additional difficulties potentially. Chris, did you want to comment on the question there? What I'm going to do, I think, is just go back to each of our panelists just for a final set of comments to wrap up. If we don't have any other questions coming in from the chat, I'll give you one quick chance if you want to raise a hand or put a question in the chat, and then I'm going to go back to our panelists just for a final comment. I'll kick off with you, Chris, then perhaps just to wrap up and give a concluding comment. Thanks.
Yeah, and thank you very much, Yvonne, and thanks to my fellow panelists as well. I loved Michelle's story about a lot being the measure. To me, that kind of captures what this discussion is all about. Is how do we say a lot, and can we get a long way beyond saying a lot? I think there are. And I think today's discussion has taken us somewhere on that journey. So I'm grateful for that. I think the questions about, I think there are still a lot of unanswered questions around what is the quality of the data that we get. Now, whether that's in terms of the kind of secondary data that is being collected in routine surveys, as Andrea has talked about, or it's in terms of pooling data into a hub, as Michelle has talked about. To me, there's a sort of surface attraction to all of that, but I always feel like when we scratch the surface, we know from our own data collection that you have to put so much work in to get clean data. So, if you've got a piece of data like our screening data, Alice, who's on this call and who's been doing much of the analysis that I presented to you today, Alice and I and other members of our team, we spent much of last year in lockdown just cleaning data, and to get to something that is we're more confident about. And of course, you can never be 100% confident anyway, but at least we've been through it and we've cleaned every single, like all the different variables. And it takes forever. And you learn a lot in the process, but I worry about data where we haven't had a kind of cleaning process. Because when you've spent so much time cleaning up a particular data set, you realize how many very different interpretations are available of a particular piece of data that you have collected, and how careful you have to be about how you assess it. I think the other thing that comes out again is that even where there's the use of proxy indicators, I think, is essential, so that you don't ask necessarily very sort of bold and intrusive questions or invasive questions. But there somewhere we need to find the time and the resources to go and do some sort of ground truthing of our interpretation of secondary data. And we need to go and do that qualitative process that Patricia talked about in her question. You know, like, okay, so when people say kept in rooms, can we go back to those people and say, so tell us more about what does kept in rooms actually refer to? And I think that finding the time and the right framework within which to go back and really probe how people are referring to these very complex experiences and very difficult experiences. I think that's something that needs more attention and it needs more resources. And I think there's a whole area of work there. So both from, we need to be working with people like the information management officers who are doing a kind of basic, I guess, a fairly basic analysis of the data that is being gathered. But then we also need to work with more on a more qualitative level to see if our assessments of that data are anywhere near accurate. So for example, for us as RLP, you know, one of the exercises I think we need to do is to go and do a sampling of those single-headed households where there are lots of children, and you know, really have a sit down in those households and try and understand, like, how did this household come into being? Who are all these people? Why are you taking care of them? What do you do, given that you've also said that food is almost your most pressing need? How on earth do you deal with that? And if somebody comes along and offers to take part of the burden away from you, how do you respond to that? So I think there's a lot of qualitative additional work that needs to be done, both quantitative and qualitative. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Michelle, any concluding comments or responses?
Actually, I wanted to go all out and say we should all start collecting data from where we are, because we all recognize what that data is important. And then after Chris talked, I realized maybe we all need to take a step back and determine what data we actually need to be collecting and how we should collect this information. And I think I'll go back to the different activities we've had here nationally, where one organization's interpretation of data collection was actually putting the individuals at risk because they collected too much information or too much data on this one individual or multiple individuals. So I hope that this conversation begins our outlook or our perspective on what is data protection, what information should we collect, even if a lot of organizations are working with survivors and victims. I think we should also remember that even in that vulnerable state, they still have a lot of rights that protect them. So even as we're collecting data, we should come from a perspective of protection and not from, oh yeah, we need to fill out this quota because the next funding relies on such and such information and so on and so forth. So I hope that, so instead of going all out and talking about how start from where you are and collect the information, I think we should all take a pause and evaluate and analyze our perspective on data and recognize that even if it's just data to you, it's personal and it's private information for someone else. It's information that probably this individual wouldn't want shared in 5 years or 10 years from now. So we need to be able to look beyond our needs and wants in this moment. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. And I think that it also raises questions around, as we've been discussing, around methodologies, being careful to avoid stigmatization of particular groups as well. And that is very context specific. If you are gathering data or speaking within households, that the relationship of trust that is there, that can be built upon, but where those relationships of trust are not there or not yet there, I think that poses again bigger challenges, in particular where that kind of data gathering may be perceived as being part of further scrutiny of a refugee household or a migrant household, or where it is internally displaced persons, perhaps in a conflict situation. So it poses all of those kinds of challenges, but I think Refugee Law Project in particular is an organization that has done so much work on similar kinds of questions in other contexts, that it would be really helpful to build on those, and to build on that experience and to bring it also into the discourse and policy and practice on human trafficking, which I think is a bit behind on some of this. Yeah. Andrea, to concluding comments. Thank you.
Sure. Sorry, I didn't mean to throw you off there, but hitting enter too soon. I put in the chat box 3 links for people. I can also send these separately, of course. One is the anti-trafficking testing guidance that I mentioned. This is our flagship production. Also the IOM counter-trafficking in emergencies information management guide. This is quite extensive. This involved contributions and review from, I think, over 60 or 70 stakeholders in the humanitarian realm, you could say. So quite a huge effort there. That was just released, I think it was early this year or end of last year. And lastly, I put a link there for the Counter Trafficking Data Collaborative. This is an example, not for emergencies or crisis settings, but this is an example of a massive data sharing operation between IOM, Polaris, and the Liberty Shared, where their anonymized case data is made available. Some people are probably aware of this. Maybe it might be new for others. This data is, I mean, the standards are incredible. It's cleaned, it's high quality, and it shows that this kind of thing is possible. It doesn't mean that this can easily transfer to emergency context, but it is possible to do, so it seems. Last closing comment from me is just that whereas a few years ago when I came to my first meeting of the anti-trafficking task team in Geneva, and we had to really argue that we even deserved a seat at the table to have a conversation with protection actors, which was kind of shocking to me. It has completely exploded since then. We are getting requests from regional offices, country offices for scoping missions, technical advice, trainings, materials, you name it. The topic has clearly taken off. So I'm happy to see that. I think it's just going to grow, and it's no longer an unknown issue. I think we're really about to see it. Yeah, I mean, the workload is just starting to get out of control, actually. So I think awareness is definitely taking off now.
Thank you very much. That's really helpful. And so just want to say a huge thank you to everyone, to all of the panelists in particular, for joining us from different parts, and to our colleagues in Kampala, in particular to David and Gilbert, for the work in bringing today's workshop and seminar together. I hope we will be able to be back to in-person meetings again relatively soon. But this was, I think, really helpful in terms of bringing forward this discussion around the different kinds of approaches to identification and documentation. And thank you all for the suggestions and additional comments also. So we will continue to work on this. I saw in the question there, we can share the PowerPoints, I think, no problem. And the session is also being recorded. So that will be made available also, and I think will be a hugely important resource. So thank you again to everyone. I hope to see you all again soon. And meanwhile, I hope everybody stays safe and well. So Chris, did you want to make a concluding comment from the Refugee Law Project? Or David? Thanks.
Thank you. Maybe David, if you needed to add something, that would be good. I mean, from my side, just to say a big thanks to all my colleagues. I'm out of the country right now, but for all the organization and the planning that went into it, and to yourself, Siobhan, and for the discussions we had prior to this. So I think it has moved the discussion forward, from my point of view, at least. As I say, I hope it's not the first, because it's never the first, but also not the last. And we add some of those other discussions into those other questions around disclosure and those more methodological questions almost into further discussions. So much appreciated. Thank you. Maybe David, are you there?
Thanks.
David, yeah.
Oh yeah, thank you so very much. Tomorrow is an important day, and this week has been a very hectic one. We just want to appreciate everyone who has made the time. to give us their 2 precious hours of this important, busy and hectic week in the thick of the pandemic times to have this conversation. And the UN is leading under the theme of victims' voices lead the way. And of course, voice is a very important word because it's at the heart of data. And if we do not look at voice as a data, and how do we harness that voice? How do we process that voice? How do we feedback that voice? Is no way to recenter the victim and the survivor into the equation. And I think this conversation is a very important preamble to how to make really victims and survivor to lead the way. So we look forward to the celebrations tomorrow from different corners, different geographies and time zones. We also look forward to carry on this conversation into practice so that we may have another perhaps webinar now when we can talk about assessment of how this data and processes and dissemination. Thank you so much and have a great rest of the day from wherever you are.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, David. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye. Stay well. Thanks. Bye-bye.